time to start our next session. It's about writing for sub-franchises, which I think is a word that DANSKY made up, sub-franchises. But he will tell us all about what that is and what he means. Richard DANSKY is central Clancy writer, is that right, for Ubisoft? Hey, I'm batting 1,000. We've been good friends for a long time, and he's a bit of a mentor for me. So I hope that the fascinating things he has to tell us today will be helpful for you guys as well. But Richard DANSKY.
That was Wendy's way of saying everything she's done wrong was my fault. So, hi everybody. Going to talk about writing for sub-franchises. I guess we start with who am I and why am I telling you this? I'm the central Clancy writer for Ubisoft/Redstorm. I've worked on somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 games, many of them in the Tom Clancy franchise. Also working on some other franchises that we've had like Might and Magic. I'm an executive member of the IGDA Writers SIG. I'm on the board of the Game Narrative Summit in Austin. I'm a guy who likes to write a lot. And hopefully what I have for you will be useful and interesting. So the first question is sub-franchises. What the hell is a sub-franchise? And she's right, it's a term I made up. But really, looking at it, it's variations on a theme. It's different places that you go within a larger franchise that explore, carve out different aspects of that, and have their own identity while still being part of a larger whole. So there are different games set in the same larger brand. They're often identified by different play styles and types. They can be set apart by time. They can be set apart by content. They can be set apart by platform. But they're all part of the bigger whole. In terms of shared universe, sub-franchise types things you might be familiar with, in comics you've got Superman, Batman, Justice League. They're all playing the same space, but at the same time they can all go off and do their own thing. Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and Silmarillion. Again, all part of the same world, but they're not direct sequels. They're separated by content, by scope, by meaning, and by tone. And Star Trek, Deep Space Nine, The Next Generation, Voyager, and well, we're not going to talk about Enterprise. So in our field, some of the big ones are Halo, where you've got 3 fairly variant franchises under the larger Halo umbrella, and the Tom Clancy stuff that I work on. Sorry, I had to get the little Power Plays one in there. But all of these, again, they fit under the larger umbrella, but they all have their own distinct identities. You've got turn-based strategy with NWAR, real-time strategy with NWAR, air combat, squad-based combat, individual stealth, but all, again, part of that larger Tom Clancy's universe. And one of the interesting challenges of my work, because I'm the central Clancy writer, is building the connections and working on the connections between all of them, working across those sub-franchises, and serving what each of those individual sub-franchises needs while at the same time doing what I can to help maintain their distinct identities and keep them as part of this larger Tom Clancy's whole. So the benefits of sub-franchising: it allows for exploration of different aspects of a universe. The Tom Clancy's brand started with Rainbow Six, which was squad-based counter-terror, and that has allowed us to tell some fascinating stories. We've gone around the world, we've done globetrotting, we've done single cities, but again, it's focused on squad-based counter-terror. It's a defined space. Moving to something like Hawks allowed us to tell bigger stories with continent-spanning air combat, things like that. Richer subject material. The more aspects of a large franchise that you can explore, I think you can give their own stage and their own breathing room to, the better off you are in many cases. So that's another benefit of having a sort of sub-franchise. And the potential for telling big stories. If you can establish your sub-franchise and then potentially tell stories that cross from one to the other, you have expanded your palette, you've expanded your scope, you can tell something really, really big. Of course, there are potential writing hazards. The book that's up there, it's called Ghost Towns. It dates back to my days working for White Wolf, and it was a crossover book between Wraith the Oblivion and Werewolf the Wild West, which was itself a sub-franchise of Werewolf the Werewolf the Apocalypse, which was part of the larger franchise of the World of Darkness. As you can see, it got a little convoluted. And so there are some perils and some hazards to doing this. One is that sub-brands have different needs. Going back to the example I was talking about, Rainbow had needs for spaces that would be really interesting for the sort of thing that you'd be doing in close quarters combat, in counterterrorism operations. Obviously, you couldn't fit the airplanes from Hawks in there, or you could, but it would be very, very crowded. Telling the sort of story, for example, that would support a counterterrorism plot line is not necessarily the same one that will support giant fleets of aircraft going at each other. Different teams have their own project needs. Obviously, every project has its own needs that they want to support, they want to use the narrative to support, and they're going to be primarily interested in making sure they do what they need to do. And if there's another team working on another project 1,000 miles away, there may be lapses in communication, there may be schedule slips, there may be places where they bump what each team needs, and this is not a case of wants, but in many cases needs, bumps up against one another. It may be as simple as one team is planning on doing a story element that somebody else is already working on that they haven't been told about yet. But that just goes to illustrate when you have sub-franchises that you need to keep the communication flowing so that everybody knows what everybody else is doing so that you don't step on each other's toes. There's ownership issues. If one project wants to kill off a character and another game wants to use him, that can be tricky, particularly if the game that's killing him off comes out first. And it can be very hard to coordinate and communicate, especially under the gun, with schedules slipping, with things being added. It's always tricky to make sure that everybody knows what's going on at all times. I mean, everybody here has had problems communicating on their own team, right? Okay, now magnify that by multiple other teams that are spread out across multiple other studios, on multiple other projects in multiple other countries. SharePoint sometimes doesn't quite do it. Nothing against SharePoint, it's a human error, but crossover is fraught with peril. What if the fans miss a part of it? One of the great benefits of doing sub-franchising things is obviously that you're sharing a universe and exploring different corners of it. But if you explore corner A and expect the fans who are playing in corner B to know what you did over there, and you hinge important stuff on it, you're going to lose a lot of those fans potentially because they weren't interested in what you did in the first game. And so you have to walk a tightrope between taking advantage of the fact that you have this richer tapestry than one game would afford you, one franchise would afford you, at the same time being sure that you're remaining accessible to the people who only want to explore one little corner of it. So some keys to success, tips, tricks, et cetera, et cetera. Points of commonality are key in making sure that you set up a sub-franchise within the larger whole and establish it. You identify the key franchise elements that need to be in all the sub-brands, the things that are absolute identifiers, they have instant impact, the things that build the universe, the things that say, yeah, this is part of the bigger whole. Those are signifiers that don't need explanation, they don't need lengthy exposition, they're just things that you instantly recognize and say, okay, here's a real estate marker. And it's really a question of what says X. In Clancy, a lot of it is the fact that it's always high-tech, it's always geopolitical, it's always real-world, and it's always plausible. And those things instantly say, yeah, we're in a Tom Clancy space. Referencing other sub-brands is the other side of that. If you've got a shared universe, you have a shared history that you can draw on. And this doesn't mean necessarily bludgeoning the player with the intimate details of continuity that nobody, including 98% of the dev team, knows about. It means having that there as a resource that you can draw on, potentially as fan service to the folks who do know this stuff, as a way of building those bridges between the sub-franchises and making the larger whole stronger. So you can have a character say, oh, remember that time when the lights went out in New York? That was something that happened in an early Splinter Cell game. If you have a character in a Rainbow Six game say it, you've built a bridge. And the player who played those Splinter Cell games will go, aha, I know what he's talking about, feel smart for getting the reference, and subconsciously will understand better that these are part of the same world. Thing X, which smart players will know is actually Thing Y, happened. That's a variation on that. That's trading on secret knowledge. One of the things that we've done a lot of times in the Clancy games is we have what actually happened, which is what the player did, and then we would provide a media story, what the world knew. And if you have a character reference the media story, again, that's a way of making the player feel smart if they know what they're referring to, if they know what actually happened, and saying that something from the first game has gotten out into the broader world to the point where it's picked up in the other game, in the other sub-franchise. And small shared details. These things don't seem like much, but they are absolutely invaluable because they're part of your visual storytelling in a lot of cases, and they're a way to subconsciously make your worlds feel identical, feel shared as you go from one to the other. And these are companies that are the same from game to game. These are billboards that you'll see in more than one game. These are references to newscasters or celebrities or little things like that that are just little bits of background color for the world. But when they're repeated, they build that sense of continuity in a way that is very valuable and not very expensive to do. You also need points of separation between sub-franchises because if you don't have points of separation, then you don't have sub-franchises. You have the Golden Corral buffet, and nobody wants that, except people like Golden Corral, but that's not what we're talking about here. So at the same time you want to build those points of commonality and those links, you also want to build some borders. You want to find out what needs to be kept to a specific sub-brand and guard jealousy and make sure it helps make that unique. And it doesn't have to be a big thing. It can even just be one character that you're holding out. It can be a play style. It can be a specific location. It can be things like that. But making sure that you have a place for each of these individual sub-franchises to plant their flag and say, this is ours, and this is what makes us a special part of this larger world, and this is why it's worth visiting here, this is why it's worth playing in this space, this is what's interesting about this particular part of the larger world. And you call out those separation as a way to reinforce that. You have your character say, no, 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 that's what the other guys do. You play up what you do and walk away from what you don't do in a way that reinforces that you're a unique part of a larger whole. And again, you constantly trade on the larger whole as being something that's great to be a part of, but you always want to make sure that you establish a separate identity within that space. Otherwise, there's no point to be building that sub-franchise. And some things to watch out for. Yes? Really, it's just about the humorous captions. That's the only reason I do these talks. They actually filmed some of that outside of Red Storm's offices recently. They closed the street, so our parking lot was blocked off.
Did you get to see Iron Man?
No. So, are we good now?
Yeah.
Okay. We can get back to the obscure comics cover. Excellent. And there's a lot of pitfalls in doing this, and we talked about some of the hazards, and there's some technique traps that you can fall into. One is don't get too constrained. Working in a sub-brand, a sub-franchise means that you can find yourself being very, very careful about what you do and don't do, and not wanting to contradict continuity, and not wanting to push boundaries, and that's dangerous because, like I said, you do need to carve out some space, you do need to make things unique, and that gives you the opportunity, and in some cases almost a mandate, to add to the world through the lens of the particular sub-franchise that you're working on. So, good universes have some give to them. Originally, the Marvel Universe was essentially New York and Monster Island. Eventually, they figured out superheroes could live other places. It took them a while, but they figured it out eventually. God bless the Great Lakes Avengers. And so don't be afraid to try and push. Don't constrain yourself. Don't say, I'm just going to do what's done before. You can build on what you've got in a way that expands the entire universe, builds originality and uniqueness for the sub-brand that you're working on, at the same time expands the universe as a whole. Don't go too deep. If only the hardcore fans know what you're talking about, then you have made a terrible, terrible, terrible mistake. There's nothing wrong with fan service, there's nothing wrong with putting those Easter eggs in there, but when they become vital, when they become the key to understanding, when that's the only way to get what you're doing, then you're going to lose a lot of your audience. And so you have to balance the notion of, yes, we're delving down into a part of a larger world here, while making sure you can still see daylight from where you're digging. Don't compete. This is a big one. A lot of sub-franchises can potentially bang into each other in terms of, if they're part of the same universe, they're at least partially in the same space, and that can lead to competition, either intentional or otherwise, for a location, for a character, for a plot line, okay, we both had this great idea, who's going to get it out there first? And going deliberately into competition with the other parts of your own universe just means the universe loses. You can end up in this sort of tit for tat where you're constantly knocking each other down instead of building the universe as a whole. One of the great examples of this was actually a shared novel series that I read when I was a teenager. And you could tell about 3 books in when the authors suddenly decided that the name of the game was not to build the world, but rather to kill off each other's characters, because they turned over the entire cast in the space of about 2 novels. Don't rewrite the past. Retconning is fun, but respect what the audience loves. If you're building part of a larger universe, then you're building part of that larger universe. You've been granted the space to play in inside this bigger whole. You are, and this is a terrible thing to say, but you are renting. And so the reason that it is there for you to play in is because there are things that people love about it, that it's successful enough to demand this further exploration, that there are good things there. And simply walking in and saying, nope, I'm going to carve out my own space and the hell with everything else, goes against the very reason you're supposed to be doing what you're doing. And it is very tempting to look at stuff that frustrates you or that you don't like and just want to set it all on fire. But at the same time, it's there for a reason. If there are things that need development or evolution or smoothing over, there are better ways to work on it and benefit the larger franchise as a whole than just setting the whole thing on fire. And don't hide. There's always the temptation to think, okay, they might not like what I'm doing, so I won't show it to anybody until it's too late. This can be problematic. Because yes, if you don't show it to anybody until it's too late to change, they may not be able to make you change it if they don't like it. They may also make a change in the writer position. Because you have violated process and caused problems for other people involved in the project and the franchise and everything else. On the other hand, if you're open and upfront about what you're doing, particularly in terms of stating your intentions and laying out a roadmap for where you're going with it, as opposed to just bringing a surprise on them, then you can get a lot further. You also open up avenues of collaboration across the broader franchise within the sub-franchises. So if you're doing something cool in one, maybe that can inspire or trigger something somebody else is doing in another one, and you can get some unintended but very beneficial strengthening between the two. And that is all that I've got, apart from being eaten by a dinosaur. So.
What challenges do you see when the franchise is not following consistencies already in the world? Like, you got a reality-based superhero like Batman, and an alien-based superhero like Superman, and a magic superhero. Like, how do you work those issues out franchise-wise when the rules are not set up correctly from the very beginning? How do you fix those problems?
I think a strong authority on franchise matters, and laying down basic guidelines. Building the walls of the sandbox and having somebody stand guard on the walls of the sandbox is very important. And even if you have internal elements that don't necessarily jibe, if you have an intrinsic understanding that everybody involved has on how they're not jibing, I think that works very well. And an example I'll give you there is I spent 4 years in-house at White Wolf working on the World of Darkness. I don't know how many people here ever played White Wolf tabletop role-playing games. I will let you in on a secret. The crossover rules don't work. They never worked. And we spent endless hours arguing over how we were going to make them work, why we should make them work, whose game was going to make them work better than anybody else's, and so forth, to the point where sometimes people would sneak in rules for other people's games in their own books. But ultimately we came to a place where we said, okay, we realized that these games are not designed to work together seamlessly. They are designed to be in the same space. And we are okay with that certain level of disconnect on the nitty-gritty rules level because narratively it works so well. And once we came to that agreement, everything got a lot better, a lot smoother, and the world, I think, was better for it. And
All right, so our expert panel here, what do you guys think of this session we just listened to, this talk? What do you think?
Well, I know that most of you guys are writers, and actually you'll probably get to hear me at some point go off about how I don't feel like that term is valid for us, how narrative designer is a much stronger term. And in this particular case, one of the things I want to express, which you touched on a bit, was as a designer, there are a lot of other ways than just writing that you can sub-franchise, right? How is it that WarioWare or Mario Tennis are part of the Mario franchise, right? Well, with some characters, right? How are the Final Fantasies or the Dragon Quest connected, right? It's some mechanics. So, and a song, right? So think about all the other ways that you can connect your franchise, because as a writer, right, whether or not they've been doing it well recently, that's a different question. But the Final Fantasy writers, for example, have a lot more freedom because they haven't tried to maintain any contiguous elements for that universe at all. Not same planet, not same characters, not same timeline, nothing, right? Except for Chocobos, Marlboros, and the dude with the lantern.
Well, and that's taking some of his advice, Sarah, of planting, these are the things that work and these are our things, and we're going to carry over those things that the fans love. So I think that's a great example of how what he just talked about, even though it is writing focused, fits design wise as well.
Yeah, definitely. I just want to say, remember that use every element of your game, right? As writers, we often get caught up in thinking about the writing and the importance of the writing. Remember that you have every element, your sound, your art, your design, to create a genre or franchise.
Yeah, and to jump on that, in a lot of cases, it's the basic mechanic that establishes the space that sub-franchise is going to be working in, and that defines what sort of story you're going to build on top of it.
It's difficult to imagine a Portal sub-franchise without a Portal gun.
Yes.
I still want to see the sword fighting Tom Clancy game.
I would kill to make that.
With a sword. Kill with the sword. Okay, that felt fun. I actually worked on a sub-franchise that I can't name because the game never came out because the vision holder choked it to death. So as a vision holder yourself, the central Clancy writer, how do you avoid that? The people who are trying to work together and make new things, how do you let go and let them in and collaborate?
The best thing that I found I can do is to be available as a resource and to share as much as possible. I mean, part of my job is being the guy who knows all the Clancy games and laying out that knowledge for them, saying, okay, we did that in this other project, here's how it worked well, we've never done something like that. And just sharing what I have and giving them as big a box of Legos as I can when they ask me to collaborate with them is really the best thing that I can do. There's always the temptation on everybody's part to say this is what I'm doing and hold it close and things like that. But at the same time, the more knowledge that gets injected into the system and the more experience that gets injected into the system, I think the better everybody is. The better off it's going to be because there's more tools to get it right and more knowledge about how it could have gone wrong.
Okay, then I have to ask, where exactly is the line for you as a consultant where, another team may want to come up and do something with Tom Clancy that is completely against the Tom Clancy rules, or sort of in your mind of what Tom Clancy is? Like, let's say, I don't know, Sam Fisher wants to, learn how to make a lightsaber in the next game. He wanted swords.
Yeah, true.
So I think everyone is trying to throw ideas at you.
Yes, I know. I'm sorry, I can't take into these ideas. They're not coming. But that's where something like a brand Bible comes in, and having a document, a living document, as to here is what this game is. Here is what it is. Here is what it isn't. Here's what we will do. Here is what we won't do. Here's everybody who's ever appeared in it. Here's every bit of tech that's ever appeared in it. Here's every place we've ever gone. And having that resource there as a common point of reference, you can hold that up as a picture frame to the idea of, okay, Sam Fisher with lightsaber, does that fit in the frame? No, it's over there. Okay. And so that is the first line of defense against the wonky.
I will say that that was one of the problems with the game I worked on, was that it was all in somebody's head. It was never written down. And so they could change the rules as it went along, you know, where we followed what you said 3 months ago, and now you're changing your mind on this thing. So even though documentation is never the funnest thing to write, it is so important. I agree.
Yeah, the more information you can get out there and the more of the world, macro and micro, that gets shared, the easier this gets at and the better it gets, I think.
We have another question from the audience, then I have a thought for you.
I was just thinking about the idea of canon and how you see a number of franchises with sub-franchises will suddenly declare that, oh, this book isn't part of the canon. Have you ever run into that, like, professionally? And where does it become the point where you go, okay, well, this is just too far off the rails, so we're going to declare this is non-canon?
Yeah, I have run into that a few times, and honestly, generally, when you get to that point, there's sort of an unspoken agreement between the creators and the audience that, okay, this never happened. You know, it's like Cousin Oliver in Different Strokes. No. And so
That was the Brady Bunch.
you get to that place.
It's the Brady Bunch, man.
Brady Bunch, okay. See, it never happened.
Really wasn't in Different Strokes.
But I think at a certain point, you get to the point where everybody agrees, okay, this is not in the fans' interest, the fans aren't interested in hanging on to it, and you can gently let it go. Again, if you are in tune with the franchise and the sub-franchise you're working on, you got a good sense of what belongs and what doesn't, and it can be a little awkward, but it's the line of where you let stuff slip away is generally pretty clear.
Right. So have you ever run into anything, I guess as a further question, where something has been sort of declared non-canon, but then there's a huge backlash from the fan base that say, well, no, actually we like this?
Tom!
Hypothetically speaking, if you had a situation where the developer of the game, which was developer of the franchise, which was very successful, was not in sync with the publisher of the franchise that was very successful. I have seen situations in which the stance of the hypothetical developer was that everything that did not happen in the games they made, which is to say novels, other games that were made not by them in the franchise, et cetera, are not canon and don't exist. And then, down the line, realize that some of those things have become such a huge incorporated part of the mythology of the franchise, as far as everyone who plays it and reads the books and all that kind of stuff is concerned, that they end up themselves reincorporating stuff that they had previously sort of disavowed, even to the point of making some of that material the whole theme and content of the game they're making. Hypothetically.
So, I've been called in to consult on a couple of gigs where it's basically for comic book publishers working games industry. And one of the problems I've often run into is having, especially marketing departments, say, "Oh no, we need you to include all these characters, right?" So you get this. Just when you've got a universe that large and that deep, you get. And I think as good as the second Batman game was, you get a little bit of this where you get this smattering of characters, none of which you can go into depth. So how do you deal with situations like that where you're being asked to provide a level of, I guess, fan service that may detract from your ability to deliver an overall experience?
The best way I found to do something like that, and it's less of an issue in the Clancy
Sure.
franchise because those are largely plot driven, and we tend to kill off a lot of NPCs. Is, honestly, to steal a page from the old Star Trek Next Generation movies, which is that everybody got their shining moment. And if you give somebody a moment where the fans who want the fan service go, okay, yeah, that's what that is, that's cool, we feel good about having seen them, and then you don't need to dive any further into that. That moment is there for the people who wanted that, but it's not an ongoing thing. It resolves itself and gets out of the way. Anybody else? Panelists?
Well, I have a question for somebody I see sitting in the back. So, I have periodically been asked to come in and consult on. By the way, does everyone know Kate? Kate is an expert on sort of cultural sensitivity for all of us, and she often comes in and consults on how to not get your game banned in most of the countries of the world. I have periodically been called in to work on franchises or sub-franchises where I've said certain elements are offensive, and they've said to me, oh, those are core elements of the franchise. What do you do?
That's a great question. Well, for example, I worked on Star Wars The Old Republic for 4 years, and the question was, well, why would I have to? Because Star Wars has been around for how many years now? What's sensitive about it? But a lot of the things I was finding, besides some innocuous use of names and real world things like DIFOS, gene gaps in World War I and stuff like that, there was one of the primary things I came across was with the writing in some of the scenarios. So you're playing an evil Sith character. What do evil Sith characters do? They do evil things. Some of the things that they do are things that are not going to go over well with some countries, like torturing people. And the writing was done in such a way in some of the earlier versions of the scenarios where you had to torture the person, the NPC, in order to get what you needed to carry on with the quest. And that's a huge problem. I mean, so we basically had to do, I basically told them you need to give them an out. I mean, you can give the player the option to torture, but you can't force them to torture. Even though, yeah, that's totally consistent with the Sith, psyche and everything. But we're not Sith for real. So, LucasArts really didn't push back on it at all. They were just like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. We shouldn't do that.
So, just because I'm curious, so this particular scenario I was thinking of, I actually got called in and I was like, that character's a horrible stereotype. And they're like, that's that character. Can't be changed. I don't know. I was totally lost at that point. I was like, well, you're going to meet a lot of backlash, and they did. But when you're working with developers on franchises like that, I mean, is there anything that you've been able to work through, especially since a lot of our franchises were established? I mean, Mario himself is a horrible stereotype, right? But a lot of our franchises were established, especially now that we're reviving a lot of those, in a period where we were less aware of these things and less of a mass media. What do you do?
Well, I mean, what I've told a lot of developers and writers is basically that, to me, put bluntly, stereotype that equals laziness.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way I see it. And so when you're employing a stereotype, and we have to be clear, stereotypes, there are some that, I don't want to call them good, because I think the word stereotype has a negative connotation for most people, but I mean, for example, if I say I'm, Scottish ancestry, what are you thinking right now? Bagpipes, haggis, kilts, all that kind of stuff, brave, archery, all those kind of things. Like, well, yeah, those things comprise Scottish culture in kind of a classic, iconic sense. Now, a lot of Scottish people are very proud of those icons. They're not offended by it. Now, if you think that all Scottish people in Scotland wear kilts, play bagpipes, and only eat haggis, then that's a problem. And that's kind of where it kind of steps over the line. But dealing with that perception, so you have to balance that. I think it's okay to use some elements because honestly, like the way I see it, when I tell people in lectures, I call culture is a set of content assets. That's what culture is to me in the context of the video game. Because every culture that you think of can be comprised of a look, a feel, taste, sound, smell, all that kind of stuff. We can't represent all of that stuff in games yet today, but we represent a lot of it. So even the game worlds that we create, like when I worked on Jade Empire, we spent, months, years developing the culture that they kept calling Pan-Asian. And it was very difficult because the BioWare writers and developers kept bringing in Chinese influence. But but they said, well, look, it's Chinese then. They're like, well, no, it's Korean, it's Japanese. I was like, but I'm seeing like 90% Chinese stuff, and then like maybe a Japanese style pagoda in there too, like in one place in the game, or something like that. And so, trying to but see that, I know what they were doing. They were evoking, I wouldn't even call it a stereotype, they were evoking kind of a folk tradition, put it that way, to kind of give that feeling, which was totally fine, but there was one part in the game, kind of, I forget what it was the spirit realm, which was very much, I mean, it was very much Tibet. And it was not just Tibet, but it was Lhasa, Tibet, you know, and I mean, buildings, dress code, everything. And that's where that's where I push back and challenge them. Is that what you're trying to represent? Like, oh, no, this is totally different, has nothing to do with the real world. And it's like, well, then why does everything look exactly like Lhasa, Tibet? I mean, what are you trying to do? So it's stuff like that where basically I think there has to be a balance in there somewhere. I mean, I do think it's okay to use things that evoke a certain culture, because how else are you going to do it other than you can do it through dialogue, so you have characters talking to one another, and that kind of draws out where they're from, what their background is, all that kind of stuff, which I think is a very modern way to do it, because like most of us in the US, I mean, you probably would have known I have Scottish ancestry for the sake of the fact that I just told you, so that's one way to do it. So, but a lot of times the games don't want to take the time to draw that out because it's not important to the main plot and all that kind of stuff. So, so it's tough. I mean, in terms, I'm talking too much here, I realize, but no, it's just in terms of dealing with it in a franchise where it's like, that is our character, that is, usually if they're not going to budge on it, that's where I say, be prepared to defend yourself. And I tell them, make sure you write up at least like a one-pager that you can write or post somewhere, and you explain to your public and possibly even governments or whoever else, why you made those decisions, because you're going to need to.
So if I get my next job working on a sub-franchise, what advice would you give me?
Learn the franchise as a whole, and look for the places where it's missing pieces. No franchise is built complete and seamless and all-inclusive. There's always places to explore. There's always natural extrapolations. There's always logical places you can go with it. There's always pieces that are missing that, no matter how good the pieces that exist are, you say, I want more of this. With Star Wars originally, the thing that everybody wanted right off the bat was more Han Solo. And so, the first sub-franchise of that were a bunch of Han Solo novels by Brian Daley, I believe. And that holds true going forward. Just learn the franchise, learn what's there. You don't have to become a pure continuity wonk, but you have to be conversant with it. And you have to know which aspects of it the fans love. Diving into the message boards and seeing the stuff they're talking about, seeing which icons they're using, seeing which handles they're using that reference the franchise that you're working on. All that stuff is really useful. And then seeing where it's logical for it to go. And that's where you can make your contribution and build on the franchise that you're going to be working on.
To me, the harder questions, the things that I've had to deal with, though, have to do with who's got the authority in the situation. I mean, you referred to yourself sort of as the repository, the person who knew all the stuff about the Clancy universe, right?
Yeah, and I'm a resource. I'm not.
Right.
I'm not holding the whip hand.
This is my point. And so you have the knowledge, but you do not have the power. So who has the power in those situations to say, yes, you can do this, no, you can't do that?
That, as near as I can tell, depends on franchise to franchise. I know that you can speak better to the Halo continuity structure.
Yeah.
And who had ownership of that. Lucas obviously has a very tight continuity structure for Star Wars, things like that. And it varies from company to company. The stronger the control of the overall franchise continuity, I think the better it is for the franchise. In that there's a central point of communication everything goes through, and there's a method for expanding things out logically. At the same time, that can sometimes get a little too tight, so you want to watch for that.
Yeah, I mean, on Reach, and let me preface this by saying I had a fantastic time working on Reach. I spent 8 months embedded at Bungie, and I loved every minute of it, and I love a lot of the people over there. I had a really good time. So do not misconstrue anything I'm about to say as being negative in that sense. But I'll tell you how it's sort of set up, or it was at the time anyway. there's a guy by the name of Robert McLeese, who really was mostly an artist, but who sort of played the role that you're talking about of being the person who sort of knows everything. So if I had a question about, I need a weapon type name, or I need a place name for something or whatever, he was who I was told to go to. But he was not involved with the actual narrative of the game in any significant sense. I think he did a little chatter writing near the end of the process. The choices about those things were much more hive mind oriented at higher levels. Like we'd send stuff up, and like the Oracle of Delphi would hand the thing back down at some point. And it would be all marked up and whatever. And honestly, I can only speculate about who some of the people who were involved in those decisions. But it was an interesting way to sort of do that, because I think my impression of their approach to it is that they feel like they've got a sort of core brain trust who at the end of the day, they want to be making all sorts of decisions, not just narrative ones, but also art related or whatever else. And all that stuff gets passed by those people, and all those people have to sign off on it or give notes and have the things changed on them. Which I will say, I don't know. One thing I will say about it is I don't know that that's the most efficient process at the very least. So this is why I'm curious to hear the way other things are organized.
Yeah, no, there's always the potential for bottlenecking. At the same time, without going into too much detail, one of the things we've consistently striven for at OB is to try and make that process cleaner and quicker and more transparent. And I do appreciate the fact that they do get me involved in stuff. But you're constantly fighting the pressure of, okay, we're up against time pressure. Okay, we've got a voice shoot coming in 3 weeks. We need these scripts ready. We don't have time for them to go through all these approval processes. And so that pressure fights against the pressure to try and make sure everything is clean and transparent and shown to everybody along the way. And all you can do is, really keep at it and do the best you can.
So, I'm going to take my privilege of sitting at the table here for a second. One of my ongoing projects that I've been working on for years, actually, is helping to write a Bible for an existing cult hit that has had a few aborted attempts at not restarting it, but sequel-ish kinds of things. Anyway, it involves extracting from one person's brain all these details that he's been thinking about for years and years and years and putting it on paper. And a lot of times he'll forget to tell me really important things. Like we had this really long debate about the motivations of a particular race and what they were doing, and it came down to the end. I was saying, well, it's just human nature that they would act this way, and he finally said, well, they're not humans, they're reptiles. And I was like, well, you could have told me that 2 years ago. And he was like, well, I thought I did. And so do you have any advice for how to not, forget to say these really important things as you're sharing this information?
So this is the My Little Pony franchise you're working on?
No.
If you have the knowledge, you got to get it out there. And get it in a position not only where it's out in a way that people can see it, but make sure people know it's there for them to see it. And if you've got a knowledge holder who's not being forthcoming, you got to beat on them until they do something like that.
Well, I think one thing that we've tried is sitting down and actually having interviews where I interview him and try to ask all of the questions and then write it down. Do you have any other ideas?
I'll tell you a secret, and this is going to get me in so much trouble. Can we turn the camera off for this one? What you do is you write up everything you know, and you put it in front of the knowledge holder, and you wait for them to go, no, that's wrong! You leave the gaps for them to fill in, you let them correct. And I know that seems kind of silly, but...
No, actually, it makes me feel better because that's what I've been doing, and I kind of had to develop that thick skin to say whatever I write is going to be wrong, but at least he's going to tell me what is going on in his head.
Yeah,
at
and
least he'll be able to articulate it once he sees on paper that I got it wrong.
It draws out the missing knowledge. I mean, one of the things that comes with working in the franchise space is that you live with the franchise so long that it becomes oxygen to you. You know it intrinsically. You don't think about it. You don't think that other people don't know it because you're living with it all the time. And so you don't make the conscious effort to say, oh, wait, they're reptiles, because you've known they're reptiles for 40 years, yeah.
There are things you assume, you take for granted.
Exactly, yeah. It's become, just background noise to you. And it's not until you're jarred out of that by seeing a document in front of you that asserts, oh, they're people, that you're jolted into bringing that knowledge out, where you realize, okay, no, there has to be a conscious statement of this. And so that can be a big help.
The other thing, and this wouldn't help you, but we've started making a better effort in the narrative design group at Microsoft to start the story Bibles almost from the beginning, so that you don't find yourself in a situation like that. And the narrative, we have narrative designers and narrative producers who are basically sort of project managers on the narrative side, and part of their responsibility is to keep that from the earliest days. And I think it's going to pay big dividends. Avoiding problems like that.
And this guy has said, well, if I knew it was going to be a cult hit, I would have written a Bible. But
Sure.
he was just, making a game and didn't think about writing a Bible that could be used for future games. So,
I think we had a question over here.
I just was curious from a writer's standpoint, how important do you think continuity is when it comes to a series with like constant reboots? Like, I'm a huge Legend of Zelda fan, and the fans have constantly been arguing about the timeline, but I'm of the opinion that the timeline doesn't really matter because they're all reboots. How much stock do you put in that versus like what the fans think and what the actual IP holder thinks?
I'd give an exemption for anything from Japan, personally. I really would. No, I really would, because their rules are different.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, and to me, right, the continuity in the Zelda franchise is not in the narrative, right? And that's totally fine. We have to, as writers, come to accept that. And I actually think the Zelda discontinuity has actually given the fans something fun to play with on the side, right? So,
Parlor games. Ways to keep themselves occupied.
It's the meta-narrative.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
I do believe there was this one YouTube video that explained it all Back to the Future.
Well, and that's, I mean, like what you were saying before about Mario. I wasn't being facetious completely anyway. I mean, there are those games, at least a lot of those games are not formed around language and narrative in the same way that ones that we write in the English language for English speakers are. So I don't know that the rules always apply.
Okay, cool. I think we are about out of time. Does anybody have any closing statements, questions, brickbats they want to lob at us?
I'll say that I worked on some Roddenberry titles that were not part of Star Trek, and you fight as much of a battle saying this is not part of that universe at all, different universe. It was a huge battle to get people, because they kept trying to make it tie in some way, and it just didn't. It was a completely different idea, and that we were trying to bring a new experience where they kept wanting to tie it back in, and it was kind of the same problem but opposite solutions. So.
I have a franchise question I'd love to ask, but I think we're out of time for it.
I think we
Ask
are
it.
out of time. Ask it, and then I'll
Ask
say
it.
we're out of time in one answer.
Yeah.
Well, all right, perfect. So actually, I'm going to ask you guys a quick question. Tell me about James Bond in 2 sentences.
Sorry, we're out of time.
All right. So my main question I wanted to ask you is, every time I ask people who James Bond is, I get different answers.
Really?
Yes.
It's interesting.
Ask males and ask females who James Bond is, and you will get a different answer.
Okay.
I mean, that's me being broad, but it.
Sure.
And how do you deal with that in a franchise?
It's incredibly heterosexist, by the way.
It is. And I believe if you ask gay men, you'll also get another different answer. How do you deal with that? But that differing view on the same character, how do you make your franchise fit all the views of a character that's been
Different
broadly
ways that people
established?
see it, yeah.
Right, you say, tie in with the fans, but which fans?